Hi, I'm Steve Barlow. This is the Humanised Workforce Future You podcast video, where we're talking about perceptions of the future, issues that we need to be aware of, and their role in a rapidly changing work and life environment.
Hi, I'm Craig Saffin. The Humanised Workforce Future You podcast series is focused on the key factors evolving to create a more humanised workforce and how people from all walks of life are creating their future selves.
Welcome to the Humanised Workforce Future You podcast. I'm Steve Barlow, and as always, joined by Craig Saffin. How are you today, Craig?
Great, Steve. I'm really excited about our guest today. I'm very excited. I'm anxious to hear what he's got to say.
Absolutely, yeah. Today we've got a very special guest, Andrew Bryant, who's joining us all the way from Portugal. So welcome to our podcast, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Steve and Craig. It's a pleasure to be here.
So it's great to have you. Do you want to sort of fill us in a little bit on your background, who you are, what you do, and something about your story?
Well, in terms of your audience, you need to know that I'm British by birth, but Australian by passport. Moved to Australia at 25, and that was in 1985. So that tells you how old I am. I left Australia after 18 years and moved to Asia. I was based out of Singapore, where I developed my company, Self Leadership International, working around Asia and then expanding into the US, into Silicon Valley. I work as an author, a coach, a speaker, and a C-suite advisor. And I'm the author of 4 books, the latest coming out this year, of course, came out this year, the new Leadership Playbook, Being Human Whilst Successfully Delivering Accelerated Results, which is a tough title to say.
It's a fantastic title. I'm intrigued to know what got you into the self-leadership piece. That seems to be, I'm very interested about what drives people's passions and how they get to that point.
Okay, so I went to an English grammar school. I was a good science student, and I had my eyes set on being a doctor. I thought I'd look really cool in a mask. Little did I know that years later I'd have to wear one for 2 years nonstop. They merged my boys' grammar school with the girls' high school just before my A-levels, and my grades plummeted. And I'll leave it to your imagination to wonder why that happened. I didn't get into medicine, but I got into physiotherapy. And physiotherapy, I loved physiotherapy. It's a very practical science. It's physics, it's levers, and I graduated in 1982. Worked for a couple of years in hospitals, but quickly realized that my passion wasn't sick people. My passion was working with sports people, preparing them for peak performance. And realizing this is the 1980s. This is before sports psychology had been invented. It's before positive psychology had been labeled. And so I was at the cutting edge of this with the concept of coaching, using visualization, goal setting, etc. And so that was where my focus and my passion was. How do we make human beings the best version of themselves? I moved to Australia, as I said, in 85, and I helped some sports teams win in Australia. And as we know, Australia is sports mad. And I got a call from a managing director saying, "You helped my sports team win. Can you come and work with my management team because they suck?" And that was a fun challenge, and I went in and I observed. And one of the great things about my training as a physiotherapist is observation. Get really good at watching things. Firstly, you watch how somebody walks or runs and throws a ball, but watching how managers had meetings and talked. And I went in with a tabula rasa, with a complete blank sheet, and I was looking at the systems, because by this time I had a postgraduate in traditional Chinese medicine, and that's all systems driven. And so I could see the patterns, and I could see where the problems were, and I began diagnosing and then prescribing some solutions, and I got some success. But I had imposter syndrome, as you get. I didn't have an MBA, so I went off to get one. And I ended up arguing with the lecturers around what they were prescribing, because I was like, that won't work in the real world. And one of my professors was very insightful, I guess, because he said, "Andrew, you got some great ideas. Why don't you go and write your own book?" So I did, and the rest, as they say, is history. Four books later.
Right. What a fascinating lead in. It's amazing how many of us start off in one area, but it leads to something totally different. I think, we've interviewed some interesting lawyers on this podcast series, and they start with law, but they end up in very different areas. So, also with your sports, your professional sports thing, it's amazing the entourage that professional sports people have these days, isn't it? I think, Ashley Barty attributed a lot of her success to her mindfulness coach and stuff like that. So anyhow, let's get back on to what we should be talking about. And I'm interested about the business leadership piece. I'm not sure how to weave the Chinese medicine bit in, but the business leadership.
No, you can lead.
Yeah, the business leadership piece. What was your first observations about that? And I suppose that leads to whatever you wrote your first book about. I'm intrigued about that because it sounds like the same timing.
Yeah. Well, I realized that you can't lead others unless you first lead yourself.
Right.
And it was clear to me that many of the business leaders I was coaching or facilitating their leadership teams, that there was a correlation between their level of self-awareness and the level of other awareness. So people who weren't aware of themselves couldn't read other people.
Yes.
And that you, with certain individuals, and it's not with everybody, you could wake them up to say, hey, look in the mirror. If you're not getting results from your people, stop blaming them, look at yourself.
Yeah, right.
And there's a formula that I share in the new Leadership Playbook, which I'm happy to share with your watchers and listeners here, which is clear expectations times mindset and motivation times right behaviors equals results. And the formula starts with clear expectations. The ability to set clear expectations for yourself and for your team is often clearly lacking with managers and leaders. They have a clear idea in their mind. And something that I did with management classes that I've taught, #irony, I became an MBA lecturer. So I make people read my book. So there's a satisfaction. There's a satisfaction in that. But whenever I ask a class of managers, I said, have you ever said to your employees, after delegating a piece of work, do you understand? And they all say yes. And I say, do they understand? And they all universally say no. And I said, well, actually they do. They understand what they understand.
Right.
They don't necessarily understand what you wanted them to understand. And this is just so obvious. Communication comes from the Latin root communio, meaning to share. Yes. And we don't have communication until there's shared meaning and understanding.
Right.
And that's just so obvious. And yet it's been multiplied now that we're in this virtual environment, that we really need to make sure that wherever people are in the world and whatever time zone, and whether they're on a Zoom call or a Teams or whatever platform you're using, that there is shared understanding of the meaning, the objectives, the outcomes. And that's why managers and leaders need to help.
Do you think that, sorry to interrupt you, do you think that shared understanding is also about a degree of buy-in because if what you were describing there was like a receiving direction, rather than some of the people we've interviewed have talked about a facilitated leadership role where they're facilitating a decision-making process rather than directing it. Is that related to what you're talking about?
Yeah, well, that's the second part of the formula: mindset and motivation. Right. Carol Dweck got very famous with her book on growth mindset, and a growth mindset, is a feeling that we can try things, take the feedback, and grow rather than have to be perfect. And that clearly speaks to buy-in and ownership. And yes. Ownership speaks to self-leadership. Self-leadership is autonomy, self-law. Is that we feel much more motivated when we have some level of self-leadership around that. And again, that's something that's happened during the pandemic, is that a lot of people got more autonomy in their workflow and their timing. For instance, if you're bringing up young children and you're now on an asynchronous work phase, you can look after the kids during the day and you can do your work in the evening. Right. And then the pandemic's ended and people go, okay, everybody back to the office because we want to get control. And you're removing people's autonomy, and then people are surprised that you're getting the great resignation. If you give people autonomy, you can't take it back off them. You know, that's like the old joke: you give somebody a lick of the ice cream, and then you're going to have to fight them to get it back, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So no, you're absolutely right. It is about buy-in, but that's the second part, the expectation setting, and the expectation can be a co-creation. What are your stretch goals? What do you think we need to do? And having that conversation.
One of the things we've been finding is, some of the tech companies, which are big companies, like Atlassian and so on, and some of the lot of small and nimble agile type companies, put the agile piece in there, they're not too fussed about this new model that you're talking about, and the leadership has been trained up or has adapted themselves. But some of the more traditional companies, and I don't know, there's a lot of traditional sectors like finance sector. These companies are actually ripping their hair out trying to work out how are they ever going to get people back to work, right? It's because they're not working if they're remote, so to speak. So what are your perspectives on this, as far as an organization and its ability to change to the new environment?
Well, I was recently in Sweden speaking to one of the world's largest tooling companies around how do we engage people and theoretically get them back to what work. And I love that you've put that in parentheses, because in fact, for many people, output was greater during the pandemic than before.
Yeah.
Look, what happened at the same time that we went into hybrid work or work from home was that digitization was accelerated.
Yeah.
And what a lot of traditional companies are failing to recognize is the communication piece. And there was a recent report that I got my hands on, which looked at digital platforms like Yammer or Teams that organizations use to communicate with people. Only 8% of leaders were engaging in dialogue on these platforms. They were very good at broadcasting, but not very good at asking the questions, getting the buy-in, only 8% of leaders. Yeah. Now, leaders are saying, oh, well, we've had a decrease in engagement. Therefore, the reason for the decrease in engagement is you're not at work and I'm not leaning over your shoulder.
Yeah, right.
Wrong. That's a false equivalence, is a false cause and effect. Actually, the decrease in engagement is because people have lost the autonomy again. They're not being asked their opinion. They're not being engaged in the goal setting process. And it's surprising that tech companies that have pushed these platforms are then falling over themselves on their using their own technology. So it's crazy. But I work with Silicon Valley companies. And there's a story in the book of one CEO who I coach, him and his executive leadership team. And in 2020, I'd been over to the US and helped them with the rebranding of the company and the launch, and everything was great. The metaphor was the plane was on the runway ready to take off for a fantastic launch and year. And then pandemic hit, and I was back in Singapore where I was living at the time. And we're on a coaching call, and he is figuratively in the fetal position, sucking his thumb, going, "Why did this happen to me? This was a company that I was going to, make my name with, and why did it happen?" I said, "It didn't happen to you. It happened to everybody, and stop taking this personally. You're the leader, and you need to step up and lead your people." And he said, "Well, you're so right, Andrew." And he did. He engaged his people. He did the very things that I'm talking to you about.
Yes.
And I was having dinner with him in London 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And the company's had 3 massive quarters because they looked after the people, they engaged the people, they restructured during the organization, and they prepared. And they didn't go back to the traditional way of doing something. So I would use that as the counterpoint, that organizations need to look at being agile.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's agile is an easy thing to say. It's a hard thing to put into a traditional organization, and I think it requires a certain type of leader, sort of that you've been describing. What are some of the other main features before we move off the leader piece here, or on what are some of the, in this new work environment, and I suppose we're broadly discussing a hybrid work environment, what are some of the other key things that a leader needs in this hybrid work environment to get that engagement and to be engaged and to better lead themselves and their team?
Well, big question.
Yeah,
Realizing we have a limit. No, it's a perfect question. I could talk all day on it, but I know it's a tight podcast. Let me talk about the origin of this book. Okay. So I was working for a company's leadership, and the chief people officer said, "Look, you've coached our senior leadership team. I need a book for all of our managers so that they're all following the same way of doing it. Could you do that?" And we had this discussion around how I would do that and what the budget was. And I said, "Look, I'll write you a playbook, but I maintain the IP because I'll expand it to a full-on book." And that's how the new Leadership Playbook was origined. And so this chief people officer, her name's Mel Druth, was very keen on making it practical. A lot of leadership books are at 35,000 feet looking down. And as a chief people officer, she said, these people aren't having the basic conversations that you've taught us at the leadership level. How to have a feedback conversation, how to articulate the facts of the situation, how to inquire about the impact or the intentionality of the behavior, and how to ask for future behaviors in terms of start, stop, and continue. They need the conversation. And as I as I explore the needs, we identify for that company 10 conversations that managers needed, leaders needed to have. And we called them plays because of the American football concept of a series of set behaviors. Yeah. I expanded it in the published book to 12 plays.
So that's why you called your book the playbook, is it?
That's why I called it. That's why it's called the playbook. Okay. And the feedback that I've had from organizations are the book is selling in bulk to companies. Go, I need to buy a copy. The leader says, I need to buy a copy of this for every manager in my organization, because then they're all having the same conversation. They're all operating from the same playbook, and then that creates a culture. Right. And drilling it down to a conversation. How do you have a career conversation with somebody? How do you have a crucial conversation, right? You've had the feedback conversation, but the behavior hasn't changed. How do you have that tough conversation in a way that's human without just throwing people off the bus? Yes. I mean, I know Jim Collins said, get the right people off the bus, on the bus, and the wrong people off the bus. But you don't want to throw people off the bus unless it's absolutely your last port of call, as it were.
Yeah, I don't think Jim Collins was operating in a hybrid environment, was he? So.
Exactly. You can't throw. So, and on the hybrid environment, more than ever, it's this ability to have a conversation, just as we're having right now. We're having a conversation, not a broadcast.
Okay. Fantastic. That is fantastic. Yeah. It's you have to we're scripting for leaders in a way. So this is you call it playbook, but it's a sort of like a scripting thing, isn't it? So we used to train salespeople like this, is to have a script, and now we've got it for leaders. So can I flip it a little bit? I'm intrigued now to know. So I'm an employee working in a hybrid environment. There's been a lot written about how do you advance your career, or how do you get the personal relationships that are important for your advancement and career development. How do you do this and how do you do that? What is the outcome or the implications for an employee, say a graduate that's started in a company and is ambitious? What are the sorts of things that these people need to be focused on to operate in this new environment?
Well, I think the important thing is to see that some of the boundaries have come down. I mean, once upon a time, to get to talk to a C-level executive, you had to get in the lift and go up to a higher floor. Sure. And then there was this it's much more intimidating, and there might have been wood paneling or whatever, there was, and it was holy ground. And to walk across and, knock on the door of a C-level executive, say, I need to have a conversation, was, you just wouldn't do it. There were certain sort of psychological barriers that prevent you. But now we're one Zoom call away. Yeah. Right. And so having a voice and articulating, and smart companies are having reverse mentoring and saying, I've done this a number of times. I've got young people on my team, and I go, well, tell me why I should be on TikTok, because I don't get it, right? I mean, I'm 61. I get LinkedIn, and I suffer Facebook, but TikTok, please don't tell me I have to do that, right? Tell me, so. But the youngsters, they have a voice, and if they have had this autonomy, and they can reach out and start to build a network and offer value.
Yeah.
Right. Just because you're new in an organization doesn't mean you don't know anything. Now, you have to learn the norms of communication and be respectful and all of these things. But organizations are hungry for fresh ideas, and they are open in many ways. And there are many of these forums. So those organizations that do have social platforms contribute, ask questions, engage. And most importantly is ask for mentoring.
Okay.
Because senior leaders love to be mentors. They'll say they're too busy, but if you say, look, sir, madam, I admire your experience. I admire how much you've done. Can I buy you a coffee? You will be surprised. It's very rarely you get a no for that. They'll say, oh, I'm really busy. We can do it next month. Yeah. But if you are persistent and you're prepared to buy the coffee, virtual or otherwise, and I mean, these days I just buy people virtual coffees. Yeah. You will get the time. So find mentoring, accelerate your career as quickly as possible by getting that advice, other people's advice. We used to talk about other people's money. Now it's other people's experience.
How interesting. Okay, so you're the upshot of what you're saying is that the technology has actually made it easier and people are more accessible. And so the young people should be leveraging that, which most of them are good at it as a generalization, but some of them are good at it. And they should be, but the communication skill is still key. And that was a very interesting point you made. They still need to be able to communicate professionally and not be too.
Well, I have one of my mentees from many years ago was an intern, and he came from Romania. I was running my company in Singapore. There's ISEC is a student organization, and I'd had a previous mentor from ISEC. He came, young guy, super enthusiastic, super ambitious. And, we went on a sales call, and I remember in the car, and he says, well, how can I be like you in the shortest possible time? And I'm like, you arrogant little,
it's actually a pretty common question. That's a common question.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Anyway, but after 6 months working with me, he asked the question again. I said, you need to go travel. You need to go get some other experiences. He did that, came back, worked for me for another couple of years. He's now managing director of his own company. He's really successful. Yeah. And he's regularly gives me a shout out on LinkedIn that I was his mentor, and he wouldn't be where he was today if he hadn't been there. And that gives me a warm fuzzy. It's a legacy. Yeah. And it just reminds me of the power of answering that question and giving some good advice.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Okay, thank you. Steve, you want to just try and pull that together?
Yeah, sure. So there's been a lot here, Andrew. You've given us lots to think about and some great advice. You've talked a lot about self-leadership, obviously, and when you began talking about your story, it's pretty obvious that you exercised that and learned it on the job, as it were, in your own life. Maybe sometimes better than others, but then you said some really interesting things that I wrote down here. You can't lead others unless you can lead yourself. Is a big takeaway line there. Another one was self-awareness before other awareness. You're not going to be aware of what other people are going through if you're not aware of yourself. You gave us a formula. I think it was clear expectations plus mindset plus motivation equals results. Did I get that right?
Close. It's clear expectations times mindset and motivation times right behaviors equals results, because each is a multiplier.
Yeah.
Right. And just the point being that if you're low on, a couple of points low on any of those three, it's going to significantly decrease your accelerated results.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. That's good. And then you also said if you give people autonomy, you can't take it back. And that point really kind of led on to some challenges that people face in the workplace. How do you find ways that allow people to retain their autonomy, but at the same time as a leader to engage them? And you pointed out that a lot of leaders aren't very good at doing that, especially around the digital platforms for the communication. Talked about communication as shared understandings and getting clear expectations and that sort of thing. And one of the challenges around autonomy was also how do you engage, but how do you have the right kind of conversations? How do you create the space so that people know how to have these conversations? You talked about 12 conversations that you refer to in your latest book. And then you finished off by giving some great advice to young people, especially asking for mentoring and leveraging that, and seeing that the Zoom is sort of an equalizer, really. So in a sense, it makes it easier for people. So I hope that's a summary of what you said, that's true to what you intended, but that's what I got out of it.
No, it's very good. And I just the point before we got on the air, we were talking about the future of work. And I shared that in the book, the New Leadership Playbook, there is the report, or the summary of the report from McKinsey in 2021 around the 56 deltas that people are going to need for the future of work. And a delta is a mindset or a behavior, of which 25% of those are self-leadership. 25% are, as a surprise, are digital fluency, and 25% are interpersonal skills. Right. So at least 50% of that I've covered in the book. The other 25% is actually cognitive skills, the ability to have critical thinking, which podcasts like this promote, is your ability to think critically about the world as it is, and not just take things on face value.
Andrew, thank you very much for your insights. It's amazing. So you're very high energy and inspirational. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching this video on Humanised Workforce Future You. Please leave a rating or review for the series on the medium where you source your videos.
The transcripts for today's video can be found on craigsaffin.com. Please subscribe to the series to avoid missing out on future episodes.